When World War II erupted in 1939, the United States was not ready for the kind of war that was coming. It wasn't just a battle of soldiers and tanks. It was a war of production, innovation, and survival. Every bullet, every can of food, every drop of fuel mattered. The nation that could keep its army fed, supplied, and moving would win. But that required something the U.S. didn't have enough of: everything. By 1942, America had become the arsenal of democracy. Factories that once made cars now built tanks and planes. Farmers worked around the clock to grow food not only for their own people but for millions of soldiers across the oceans. Housewives collected scrap metal and rubber. Children gathered milkweed pods for life jackets. And scientists searched for substitutes for materials cut off by the war. The country was running out of resources faster than it could replace them. Natural rubber from Southeast Asia was gone, seized by the Japanese. Tin and copper were rationed. Even basic medical supplies became scarce. The U.S. Army had to improvise constantly, and it often turned to the creativity of its citizens for help. In small towns across the nation, ordinary people read newspaper headlines about distant battles, North Africa, the Pacific, the Eastern Front, and wondered how they could help. Some donated money. Others built parts in makeshift workshops. And a few, those with curious minds and stubborn hands, began to tinker, to experiment, to find solutions nobody had asked for. Among those quiet inventors were farmers, men and women who understood the land, who knew how to make things work when nothing else did. They weren't scientists, but they were practical. They fixed broken engines with wire, built tools from scrap, and learned the secrets of nature through necessity. When something failed, they tried again. The U.S. government soon realized that the war effort couldn't survive without this kind of spirit. Posters and radio broadcasts called for ideas, anything that could help the troops. "Your brain can win battles," one campaign declared. From makeshift labs to dusty barns, thousands of Americans answered that call. In one such barn, somewhere in the American Midwest, a humble beekeeper was about to stumble upon an idea so simple that everyone around him thought it was foolish. His neighbors called it a stupid waste of time. But in the chaos of war, even a stupid idea could change everything. Back on the front lines, the reality of war was brutal. Soldiers faced not only the enemy but disease, hunger, and the unforgiving elements. Equipment rusted in tropical rain. Rations spoiled in desert heat. Wounds became infected because antiseptics were in short supply. The Army's scientists and quartermasters worked tirelessly, but the scale of the war was overwhelming. The United States had to feed, clothe, and supply over 16 million men and women in uniform, scattered across every corner of the globe. Ships carried tons of material across submarine-infested waters. Airfields sprouted overnight in jungles and frozen tundra. And through it all, the demand for innovation never stopped. It was a time when every problem, no matter how small, could become a matter of life and death. A broken gasket might ground a plane. A contaminated bandage might kill a wounded soldier. A spoiled batch of food could weaken an entire platoon before battle. That was the world into which our farmer's story begins. A world desperate for solutions, desperate for hope, desperate for ideas that worked. He didn't wear a uniform or carry a gun, but his mind, his bees, and his belief in doing something, anything, would soon play a role no one could have imagined. Because in a war that demanded steel, fire, and blood, sometimes victory came from the most unexpected sources. From a quiet field, a buzzing hive, and a man who refused to believe that his stupid little trick couldn't make a difference. In the rolling farmlands of the American Midwest, where the wind whispered through endless fields of wheat, there lived a man named Samuel Sam Harper, a quiet farmer with more curiosity than most people thought was useful. He raised a few cows, planted corn, and kept bees, thousands of them, humming endlessly in neat rows of wooden hives behind his barn. To his neighbors, he was the bee man. To himself, he was just someone trying to make things work. When the war began, Sam watched his two sons march off in uniform. One joined the Army Air Forces, the other became a medic. Every evening, Sam would listen to the crackling radio in his kitchen, hearing reports from North Africa, Sicily, and the Pacific. He couldn't sleep. He kept thinking, what could he do? He was too old to fight, but maybe not too old to help. Beekeeping had taught Sam patience, observation, and respect for nature's small miracles. He knew honey never spoiled, and that beeswax could seal almost anything. He remembered how his grandfather had used it to waterproof boots and treat minor wounds. But in 1943, nobody in the army cared about a beekeeper's tricks. One evening, while repairing a broken hive, Sam overheard two local factory workers talking about the army's supply troubles, how rations spoiled in tropical climates, how field bandages went bad in storage, how gun parts rusted even when oiled. The soldiers needed protection from heat, moisture, and infection, and Sam suddenly saw a connection that no one else had. What if, he thought, honey and beeswax could help? It sounded ridiculous even to him. But the more he thought, the more sense it made. Honey was naturally antibacterial. Scientists had proven that years ago. Beeswax could repel water better than most synthetic coatings. Together, they formed a natural shield, one that nature had perfected over millions of years. That night, Sam didn't sleep. By morning, he had sketched out an idea on the back of an old seed catalog. A mixture of refined beeswax, honey, and a few harmless stabilizers that could preserve, seal, or protect military gear in harsh conditions. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't scientific. But it was something. He began to test it in his barn. Using an old kerosene stove, Sam melted beeswax into a golden liquid, stirred in honey, and poured the mixture into small tins. He coated a few metal tools and left them outside through rain and frost. Weeks later, they hadn't rusted. He tried the same with a strip of cloth soaked in his mixture. It repelled water completely. Excited, he sent samples to a local army supply depot with a short handwritten note. Sir, I believe this substance could help protect equipment and supplies from moisture and spoilage. Made from natural American products. Samuel Harper, beekeeper. Weeks passed with no reply. Neighbors laughed. You think they're gonna fight Hitler with honey? One joked. Even his wife gently told him to focus on the farm. They needed the harvest. But Sam refused to quit. He began experimenting further, trying to see if his honey blend could preserve food longer or seal wooden crates used for shipping supplies. Slowly, word began to spread. A local chemist grew curious and asked to test it. The results were surprising. The mixture prevented bacterial growth and corrosion more effectively than some standard military sealants. In late 1943, Sam received a telegram requesting further samples for testing. Quartermaster Research Division, Washington, D.C. He read it 3 times, unable to believe it. The Army wanted his stupid little idea. For the first time in months, Sam smiled. His barn became a small workshop, the air filled with the scent of warm wax and honey. His wife packed jars while he tinkered with formulas late into the night. He wasn't chasing money or fame, just the hope that maybe, somewhere on the other side of the ocean, his sons might be a little safer because of something he'd made with his own hands. In the middle of the largest war in human history, a simple farmer, armed only with patience, bees, and stubborn faith, had found his way into the fight. And though he didn't know it yet, his strange golden mixture would soon travel farther than he ever imagined, reaching the front lines where it would help save lives, one soldier, one jar at a time. When Samuel Harper's package finally reached Washington, it didn't go to any general or scientist. It ended up on the desk of a young chemical technician at the Quartermaster Research Division, one of thousands of civilians testing odd materials sent by patriotic Americans. The label read simply, Harper's Honey Wax Protective Compound for field use. The technician opened the jar, sniffed, and frowned. "Smells like breakfast," he muttered. Still, he applied the thick golden paste onto a few rusted tools and stored them in a humid chamber for testing. No one expected much. Most homegrown ideas were useless, everything from cornstarch bombs to potato fuel. But within 2 weeks, the technician noticed something odd. The treated tools hadn't corroded at all. He logged the results, stamped the report inconclusive, and moved on. Yet, a few weeks later, a field officer passing through the lab saw the sample, read the note, and took a tin back to his unit. He thought it might help keep moisture off their rifles in the South Pacific. That small act would start something extraordinary. Meanwhile, back in Iowa, Sam Harper had no idea that anyone had even read his letter. The war raged on. His eldest son's letters came less often. Every day he checked the mailbox with a quiet hope, but months passed without a single word from Washington. Neighbors still teased him about that honey goop. "Sam, the Army doesn't need your jam," one friend joked at the feed store. "They've got scientists for that." Sam just smiled. "Maybe," he said softly, "but sometimes even scientists forget what nature already knows." Then one cold morning in February 1944, a military jeep pulled into his driveway. 2 men in uniform stepped out, a captain and a civilian engineer. They introduced themselves as representatives from the Quartermaster Corps. "Mr. Harper," the captain said, shaking his hand, "we've been testing your compound. It's interesting." They explained how his formula had shown remarkable resistance to salt water and tropical humidity, better than some synthetic coatings used on field equipment. The Army wanted to test it further. They needed more, a lot more. Sam's wife, stunned, brought coffee while the men took notes. They asked him about his process, the exact mix of beeswax to honey, the heating temperature, the stabilizing agent. Sam answered carefully. He didn't have a laboratory, only a kerosene stove and an old copper kettle. When they left, he stood in the doorway watching their jeep disappear down the dirt road. For the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, his stupid trick wasn't so stupid after all. Within weeks, the Army sent supplies to help him scale production. Local farmers donated wax and honey. The small town rallied behind their beekeeper. The post office became a hub of shipments. Metal tins packed with golden paste labeled Protective Compound Number 27. But not everyone believed. Some in Washington dismissed the idea entirely. "We're fighting a war, not baking pies," one colonel famously said when he heard about the honey-based coating. Engineers scoffed. Chemists argued that natural substances couldn't match industrial formulas. Still, the field tests told another story. In the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal and New Guinea, rifles treated with Harper's mixture stayed clean and dry longer. Food crates sealed with the wax blend resisted mold and insects. Even minor wounds treated with a diluted version healed faster, a discovery made by a field medic improvising with what he had. Soon, letters began reaching Sam from soldiers he'd never met. One wrote, "Sir, whatever that honey stuff is, it works. My rifle stayed dry through the monsoon. Tell your bees they're doing their part." Sam read each letter by lantern light in his kitchen, eyes wet with pride. He never imagined his bees would be fighting alongside his sons. By mid-1944, the Quartermaster Corps quietly authorized limited use of the compound in several theaters. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it worked. Cheap, simple, and made entirely from American farms. And so the stupid trick became a quiet secret of the war effort. Even as newspapers celebrated tanks and bombers, No one wrote about the farmer with his hives. Yet, in the muddy trenches and dripping jungles, the faint scent of honey sometimes lingered on crates, rifles, and bandages. A silent reminder that victory wasn't only forged in steel, but in the stubborn hope of one man who refused to laugh at his own dream. By the summer of 1944, the war had reached a fever pitch. In Europe, Allied troops were pushing inland from Normandy. In the Pacific, brutal jungle battles raged from Saipan to New Guinea. Everywhere, soldiers faced an enemy more relentless than bullets, nature itself. Tropical humidity corroded metal in days. Boots rotted. Bandages turned foul. Mold spread faster than any army could march. The U.S. military's engineers were desperate for solutions, and that's when the strange little honey-based mixture from an Iowa farm began to attract real attention. At the Quartermaster Research Division, scientists began breaking down Harper's compound piece by piece. They discovered what Sam Harper had only known by instinct. Honey contained hydrogen peroxide, a natural antiseptic that killed bacteria. Beeswax formed a moisture barrier stronger than many synthetic coatings, while its subtle acidity slowed oxidation. Together, the two created a perfect harmony: protection, preservation, and healing, all from the hive. The irony wasn't lost on the researchers. While chemical labs across the country poured millions into developing complex synthetic polymers, one farmer's bees had already produced a material that nature had perfected over millions of years. In August 1944, military scientists began field trials under the name compound H27, the H quietly standing for honey. They coated rifle parts, ammunition boxes, and surgical tools, then exposed them to harsh conditions: seawater, mud, and tropical heat. The results stunned them. The treated items resisted rust, mold, and corrosion far longer than standard materials. Even more remarkable, the waxy film could be melted away easily, leaving no residue or chemical damage. Soldiers could clean and reuse their gear instantly. Soon, the U.S. Army Medical Corps took interest. A doctor at a field hospital in the Philippines experimented with using the honey compound to seal bandages. The wounds healed cleaner with fewer infections, something military doctors struggled with due to the shortage of sulfa drugs and penicillin in remote areas. Back in Iowa, Sam Harper continued working quietly in his barn, unaware of how far his idea had spread. He only knew that the Army kept asking for more. Local newspapers began to whisper about the bee man's secret weapon, but official channels kept the details classified. The government didn't want the enemy, or anyone else, to know how a farmer's bees were helping win the war. Meanwhile, in laboratories across the U.S., chemists tried improving Harper's formula without losing its natural simplicity. Some added small amounts of lanolin to make it softer in cold weather. Others blended it with alcohol to sterilize medical instruments more easily. Every version kept one thing constant: the honey and wax at its heart. On the front lines, soldiers didn't care about the chemistry. They just knew it worked. Mechanics used it to coat engine parts on amphibious vehicles. Medics carried tins of it for emergency wound sealing. Sailors rubbed it on ropes and boots to prevent mildew. Some even joked that it smelled like home. A Marine in the South Pacific wrote home saying, "You'd laugh, Ma. We're fighting in mud and bugs, and it smells like your kitchen back home." The simplicity of it all amazed everyone who learned the story. In a war dominated by steel, fire, and industrial power, a humble blend of honey and wax had become a quiet hero. It didn't win battles by itself, but it kept men alive long enough to fight them. By late 1944, the Quartermaster Corps issued a small directive to increase production of compound H27 for limited distribution to Pacific units. The project remained unofficial, but those who used it swore by it. Sam never sought recognition. He sent every payment he received to the local war bond office, saying, "The bees did the work. I'm just their messenger." His neighbors, once skeptical, now helped him harvest wax and filter honey for the growing demand. The entire community became part of his quiet mission. In a world torn apart by bombs and ambition, it was almost poetic that something as gentle and natural as honey could heal, protect, and preserve life amid such destruction. The scientists would later call it a biological innovation. The soldiers called it the honey fix. But for Sam Harper, it was simply proof that even in war, nature still had something to teach mankind, if only they were humble enough to listen. By the beginning of 1945, the quiet miracle that started in one man's barn was spreading far beyond Iowa's cornfields. What began as jars of honey and beeswax melting on a kerosene stove had evolved into something the U.S. Army could no longer ignore. Compound H-27, as the Quartermaster Corps now called it, was being tested, refined, and, for the first time, produced on an industrial scale. Word reached Washington that the material was saving both equipment and lives. Tools coated with it lasted longer in salt air. Food shipments sealed with it reached soldiers fresh and unspoiled. Field medics praised it for preventing infection when nothing else was available. The Army quietly authorized limited contracts for production, not from chemical giants but from rural cooperatives and small-town beekeepers. Factories that once canned fruit were converted to melt wax and fill tins. Honey farms across the Midwest and South began shipping barrels of golden syrup to government depots. Every drop mattered. Beekeepers who had once sold their harvest at local fairs now worked under government requisition. The slogan, "Sweeten the front lines," appeared on posters encouraging citizens to donate honey and wax for the war effort. For Sam Harper, the transformation was surreal. His farm had become a small command center. Military trucks rumbled down his dirt road, collecting shipments from neighboring apiaries. He worked alongside local teenagers and retired farmers, teaching them how to mix the compound safely and pack it for delivery. His wife kept records by hand, listing every pound of wax used and every jar shipped. Newspapers finally caught on, publishing short pieces about the farmer whose bees went to war. Yet Sam avoided attention. When a reporter asked for his picture, he politely refused. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about making sure our boys come home." The story inspired others. Small producers in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Pennsylvania wrote to Washington offering their hives and manpower. In a matter of months, a national network of beekeepers formed under the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. They called themselves the Bee Service Corps, and their mission was clear: keep the flow of wax and honey steady until victory. In converted warehouses, vats of wax boiled day and night. The sweet, earthy smell filled the air as women in overalls poured the mixture into tin molds. Engineers introduced better stirring machines and temperature gauges, but the formula itself remained Sam's: simple, natural, and effective. Every shipment carried a faint golden sheen that seemed to reflect something deeper: the unity of a nation turning its most humble resource into a weapon of endurance. Meanwhile, scientists found even more uses for the compound. Coated ration boxes were less likely to attract insects. Ammunition stored in wax containers stayed dry in monsoon rains. In the field hospitals of Burma and the Philippines, the paste was used to seal surgical dressings, slowing infection rates dramatically. Some pilots began rubbing it on goggles to prevent fogging, a trick passed from one squadron to another. The military never announced these details publicly. Officially, Compound H-27 didn't exist. But among soldiers and sailors, the honey grease became legend. It symbolized ingenuity, proof that not every solution came from a lab or a general's order. By spring 1945, over 1 million pounds of beeswax and honey had been processed for the war. The production boom lifted rural communities out of hardship. Farmers who had lost sons found comfort knowing their hives were helping protect others. The hum of bees became the quiet rhythm of homefront victory. When the war finally ended that summer, factories began shutting down their military lines. The Bee Service Corps disbanded, its members returning to their fields. But the legacy of those frantic months endured. The government's post-war research would later credit compound H27 for inspiring new generations of natural preservatives and protective coatings used in medicine, food storage, and industry. For Sam Harper, the transition back to peace was gentle. His barn no longer buzzed with workers, only with bees. One evening, as he scraped the last bit of wax from an empty vat, he smiled to himself. The world had changed forever, and somehow his little apiary had played a part. He never received medals or ceremonies, only a single letter from the Quartermaster Corps thanking him for his contribution to material conservation and troop welfare. But that was enough. He folded it carefully and placed it beside his son's wartime photos. Because for Sam, and for every farmer who had lent their hands, the revolution wasn't just about wax and honey. It was about proving that even the smallest lives, bees, farmers, dreamers, could move the machinery of history. By 1945, the war had turned into a brutal test of endurance. Soldiers weren't just fighting enemy fire, they were battling the jungles, the oceans, the heat, and disease. In every theater, from the Pacific Islands to the Italian mountains, survival often depended on tiny details. The right tool, the right ration, the right medicine at the right time. And somewhere in that struggle, a simple jar of honey-colored paste began saving lives. The Army called it Compound H27. The soldiers just called it the honey stuff. It wasn't glamorous like a new rifle or a tank, but its presence could mean the difference between life and death. In the Pacific, Marines used it to coat the metal parts of their M1 rifles before long patrols through the swamp. Rain poured, mud splashed, and yet the rifles still fired clean. Mechanics in the Navy smeared it on electrical fittings aboard landing craft to keep out the salt spray. Medics carried small tins in their packs to treat cuts, burns, and even insect bites when supplies of sulfa powder ran low. In Burma, one field medic named Corporal James Wilkins wrote in his diary, "Ran out of proper antiseptic again. Used the honey compound on Private Larson's leg wound. No infection. He's up and walking today. I don't know who made this stuff, but I owe them a beer." The reports kept coming. Wounds healed faster. Equipment lasted longer. Food stayed fresher. No one in the field knew the name Samuel Harper, but his quiet invention had reached them all, across oceans and continents. Even military doctors began to take notice. At a hospital on Leyte Island, doctors documented cases of burn victims treated with a thin layer of the honey compound. The patients healed with less scarring and fewer infections. Later analysis confirmed what nature had always known. Honey's enzymes released small amounts of hydrogen peroxide, creating a natural antiseptic environment, while the beeswax sealed the wound against moisture and dirt. Back home, Sam received only short telegrams from the Quartermaster Corps requesting more shipments. He had no idea how widely his mixture was being used. He worked day and night, melting wax, filtering honey, and pouring the golden substance into tin after tin. His wife, Martha, labeled each one by hand. Sometimes she'd pause, stare at the neat stack of jars, and whisper a quiet prayer for the soldiers who might hold them next. One evening, as Sam was locking up the barn, a telegram arrived from overseas. It was from a group of soldiers stationed in the Philippines. The message was simple. "Your honey compound kept us alive through the monsoon. Thank you from the 24th Infantry Division." Sam read the words again and again, his hands trembling. For the first time, he truly understood the reach of what he had created. In those final months of the war, as battles raged across the Pacific, Compound H-27 became an unspoken symbol of resilience, a quiet ally in the background. Soldiers passed tins of it between units, sharing it like gold. Some used it to polish boots before inspections. Others rubbed it into wooden rifle stocks to protect them from cracking in the sun. Even captured Allied prisoners, when liberated, told of using the mixture from old supply crates to clean wounds and survive infections. The honey had found its way everywhere, sometimes by accident, sometimes by fate. When the war finally ended in August 1945, millions of men returned home. Many never learned the origins of that small, golden jar they'd carried in their packs. But some remembered, and years later, a few veterans wrote letters to the Quartermaster Corps asking who had made it. One of those letters found its way back to Iowa. Sam Harper read it in his kitchen one autumn evening. It was from a man named Wilkins, the medic who'd saved his comrade's leg in Burma. "Dear Mr. Harper, they told me it was your honey compound that kept us going. I still remember the smell, sweet and clean, even in that hell. I thought you should know that it made a difference." Sam folded the letter carefully and set it beside the old telegram. He didn't say much, just looked out the window toward his beehives glowing in the sunset. The war had taken so much from so many, but in some small way, his bees had helped bring a few men home. A humble jar of honey and wax, born from patience, stubbornness, and a farmer's faith, had proven that even the simplest gifts of nature could save lives when humanity needed them most. When the war finally ended, America erupted in celebration. Streets filled with cheering crowds, confetti rained from tall buildings, and soldiers came home to a nation forever changed. But for Samuel Harper, the quiet farmer from Iowa, the end of the war brought not cheers, but silence. His barn stood half empty, his bees buzzing lazily in the summer air, unaware that their honey had once touched every corner of a global war. For months, Sam didn't know the full story of what his stupid idea had achieved. The Army's use of his honey-based compound had been buried in supply records, just another line item among millions. To the world, it was simply standard-issue lubricant, antiseptic, and sealant type H-27. No credit, no headlines, just results. Then, one autumn morning in 1946, a government truck rumbled up his gravel driveway. Two men in neat gray suits stepped out, holding a metal case. They introduced themselves as representatives from the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Army Quartermaster Corps. They wanted to talk about his experimental bee compound. Sam invited them into his barn, where rows of dusty tins still sat stacked in old wooden crates. One of the men opened a tin, sniffed it, and smiled. "You have no idea," he said, "how many lives this little thing has saved." They explained how the honey-based mixture had not only protected weapons and machinery but had been adopted by field medics, engineers, and even aircraft mechanics. In the tropics, it had prevented metal corrosion that would have grounded entire fleets. In Europe, soldiers used it to protect cables from freezing in harsh winters. The stupid farm experiment had quietly become one of the most effective multi-use materials of the entire war. The men handed Sam a certificate of commendation, modest, printed on government paper, but carrying the weight of gratitude from thousands of soldiers. Sam read the words slowly. "In recognition of innovative contribution to the wartime material effort." He smiled faintly. No medals, no fame. But for him, it was enough. In the years that followed, researchers studied the properties of his honey compound. They discovered that beeswax created a near-perfect oxygen barrier, while natural honey enzymes fought bacterial growth. Scientists began using the formula as inspiration for modern wound dressings and corrosion-resistant coatings. By the early 1950s, commercial manufacturers had developed medical-grade ointments based on honey and wax, an evolution of Sam's wartime creation. But Sam never patented his formula. When asked why, he simply said, "It wasn't mine to keep. The bees did most of the work." His farm became something of a local legend. Reporters from small-town newspapers came to interview him, calling him the beekeeper who helped win the war. He always laughed when they said it. "I didn't win anything," he'd reply. "I just listened to nature." One summer afternoon, a veteran came to visit. It was Corporal Wilkins, the medic who'd written to him years earlier. He was older now, limping slightly from an old wound. The two men sat on the porch, drinking sweet tea, watching the bees drift lazily across the clover fields. Wilkins told him how soldiers had passed tins of the honey compound from one unit to another, how they'd used it for everything from treating burns to fixing radios. "We thought it was government magic," he said with a grin. "Turns out it came from a farm in Iowa." Sam chuckled quietly, looking out at his hives. "Funny thing, isn't it? People thought I was crazy when I started mixing honey with grease." Wilkins nodded. "Sometimes genius looks stupid until it saves a life." The two men sat in silence for a while, listening to the hum of the bees. The war felt far away now, like a bad dream that had finally faded into memory. But in that golden light, surrounded by the quiet buzz of the creatures that had made it all possible, Sam felt something he hadn't in years: peace. When Sam Harper passed away in 1958, the local newspaper wrote a short obituary. It didn't mention military awards or scientific recognition. Simply read, "Samuel Harper, farmer, beekeeper, and innovator, whose work helped save lives during World War II, passed peacefully at his home." But for the men who had lived because of his stupid trick, his legacy endured. In the field kits of medics, in the archives of Army engineers, and in the memory of every soldier who had opened a small golden tin in the mud of war, the farmer's idea lived on. The world had called him foolish once, but history had a way of rewriting its judgments, because sometimes it takes time, and a few million saved lives, for the world to see that what looks stupid in the beginning was genius all along.